following morning began with a heavy fog settled over the jungle like a thick curtain. Rachel woke in her tent to the scent of damp earth and the sound of dripping leaves. She sat up slowly, her back sore from the hard ground, and listened. No bird song, no chatter of monkeys. Just the distant trickle of water and the occasional snap of a falling branch. Mateo emerged from his own tent moments later, his boots already laced and his journal in hand. He handed her a thermos of lukewarm coffee and pointed to a narrow trail veering away from the river. According to his father's journal, that path led deeper into a region rarely touched by formal maps. The notes described it simply as the ridge with no coordinates, just a crude sketch and the phrase, "Do not return after sunset." They packed lightly, taking only water flashlights and the camera Rachel now carried around her neck like a relic. The rainy season had come early that year in the OSA Peninsula. By late April of 2001, the jungle trails had become near impassable, soaked and slick with months of rainfall. Trees leaned heavily under the weight of moss and waterlogged vines. In the midst of the slow season, when few dared to trek beyond the main eco-lodges, a Belgian traveler named Lucas Meyer attempted to navigate the older paths described in an outdated trail guide he had picked up in San Jose. Lucas was not an experienced hiker, but he was drawn to places others avoided. After 2 nights camping in the bush, the soles of his boots were peeling, and his map had all but dissolved from the constant humidity. It was during his 3rd morning after slipping on a wet slope and sliding several feet down a hill that he noticed something half buried beneath a thicket of ferns and dead leaves. The object looked like a small rusted lunchbox at first, but when he brushed away the damp foliage, he realized it was an old camera, the kind with a solid metal body and manual winding mechanism. It had clearly been there for years. The casing was corroded and the lens was clouded with grime. Lucas brought the camera back to Puerto Jiménez, unsure what to do with it. He showed it to the owner of a small internet cafe who knew some English and seemed curious. Together, they opened the film compartment expecting nothing but mildew and ruined film. Instead, they found a single roll still intact inside the chamber. The film was water-damaged, curled, and brittle, but not completely destroyed. The cafe owner had a cousin in San Jose who worked at a photo lab and agreed to send the roll for professional recovery. 2 weeks later, Lucas received an envelope marked with the lab's stamp. Inside were several black and white photos printed on glossy paper. He flipped through them slowly, his brow furrowed deeper with each image. They were mostly portraits and candid shots of jungle wildlife, but something about them felt eerily intimate. There were monkeys swinging across narrow branches, colorful birds mid-flight, and one close-up of a frog balanced on a tree root. Then came a sequence of 3 pictures that froze Lucas in place. The first was a shot of a man sitting by a campfire staring into the distance. His expression was tense. His clothes were damp. A canteen rested beside his boot. The second photo was taken from farther back. The same man, now crouched, appeared to be scanning the forest with a pair of binoculars. Behind him, crudely painted symbols could be seen on the tree trunks. They looked like spirals and slashes done in charcoal or some dark ink. The third photo showed the man sleeping. The angle was different. It was not a self-timer or a reflection. Someone else had taken it. The man was on his side, eyes shut, mouth slightly open, with his hands tucked under his face like a child. A blanket was pulled over his body. There were no other people visible in the frame, but whoever captured the image had been standing no more than 5 feet away. The man in the photographs was white with dark wavy hair and a lean build. Lucas took the prints back to the cafe owner and asked if he recognized him. The cafe owner stared for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he opened a drawer beneath the counter and pulled out a folded flyer. It was old and stained, the ink faded but still legible. At the top was the word missing in bold black letters. Beneath it was a photo of the same man, Mark Ellison. Disappeared June 1987. Last seen near the Rio Tigre trailhead. Lucas was stunned. He asked what had happened to him. The cafe owner explained the story as best he could. American photographer. Vanished while hiking alone. No remains. No confirmed sightings. Just a mystery that had gone cold. Lucas asked what had been done with the investigation. The cafe owner gave a small shrug. It was too long ago, people moved on. Police had no answers. The jungle kept its silence. Lucas left the cafe that day carrying the photos and the rusted camera. He felt a strange obligation to do something. He contacted the U.S. Embassy in San Jose, who referred him to the regional consulate. He wrote a detailed email attaching scanned images of the photographs. Within weeks, the images made their way back to the States to a desk in Chicago, where Rachel Ellison sat with trembling hands as she opened an envelope marked confidential. When she saw the face in the photo, her breath caught in her chest. There was no doubt. It was Mark. 18 years older in memory, but the man in the photo was frozen in time. Alive, alert, aware of something, but also watched. Rachel took the photos to a private investigator, one she had hired briefly in the early 90s before running out of funds. The man examined the images and agreed they appeared genuine. He pointed to the symbols on the trees and offered a chilling possibility. These markings were not random. Some indigenous tribes used similar signs for boundaries or warnings. The implication was clear. Mark may have entered sacred or protected territory. If that were true, and he had been observed or captured by people unknown, then it was possible he had not been alone. And if the final photo was taken by someone else, it raised an even darker question. Had Mark been held? Was he being watched for weeks before his disappearance turned into something worse? Rachel pressed the investigator to look into tribal records, government archives, anything that might hint at undocumented groups living in isolation. He found nothing substantial. Costa Rica had long denied the existence of uncontacted tribes in that region, though some locals spoke in hushed tones about strange sightings in the hills. In the years since tourism had expanded and the jungle had become more accessible, but that only deepened the mystery. How had a man survived long enough to leave behind these photographs only to vanish without ever reaching safety? By the end of 2001, the trail grew cold again. Lucas returned to Europe. The consulate closed the inquiry due to lack of evidence. Rachel, however, held on to the camera. She kept it on a shelf beside her brother's old sketchbooks and field notes. Every now and then she would take it down and run her fingers over the scratched metal. Somewhere out there, her brother had tried to send a message. The photos had survived. Maybe something else had too. The rediscovery of the camera breathed life back into the case. For the first time in over a decade, there was visual proof that Mark Ellison had not died the day he disappeared. The camera and the undeveloped film changed the status of his file from presumed dead to unresolved missing. But even more importantly, it introduced two powerful and unsettling twists. First, Mark had been alive for longer than anyone thought. Second, someone else had been close enough to photograph him during his final known days. Together, these revelations hinted at a truth that lay deeper in the jungle, waiting to be uncovered. By the time the photos reached the authorities, Rachel had already begun her own investigation. She felt as though she had been handed a rope in the darkness, something tangible to hold onto after years of silence. The images reignited a quiet fury in her, a determination sharpened by time rather than dulled. She printed every photograph in large format and pinned them across the walls of her home office. Each image was a clue, a puzzle piece. She examined every shadow, every smudge of dirt, every tree in the background. She knew the case had officially gone cold, but she had never stopped believing that her brother's story was unfinished. The camera had resurfaced. Someone had mailed a postcard. Now there were photos proof that he had not died in the first days after his disappearance. She believed there had to be more, something that would explain what had really happened in that jungle. Rachel contacted old friends of Mark's, even those she had not spoken to in over a decade. She asked about his travel plans, whether he had ever mentioned new locations or alternate trails. One of his college friends remembered a map Mark used to carry with penciled notes in the margins. Another recalled that Mark had written a letter before leaving for Costa Rica, saying he might extend his stay to explore deeper regions near the Golfo Dulce. Rachel searched the attic, the basement, the boxes left untouched since the 80s. She found the letter yellowed and brittle, stuck between the pages of a field guide. In it, Mark had mentioned meeting a guide named Ernesto near the river town of La Palma. The name meant little to Rachel at first. But when she began reaching out to local historians in Costa Rica, one of them confirmed that a man named Ernesto Ruiz had worked as an independent guide during the 1980s. That was the first thread. Ernesto Ruiz had died in a car crash 2 days after Mark disappeared. His truck had rolled down an embankment late at night on a road leading away from the jungle. There were no witnesses and no signs of foul play. At the time, no one had connected his death to the missing American. But now, Rachel saw it differently. She asked for the accident report. It described a simple loss of control attributed to slick roads and poor visibility. However, the autopsy noted an unusual bruise pattern on the side of Ernesto's head not consistent with the reported accident. Rachel flagged the detail and kept reading. She learned that Ernesto's son Mateo had been only 8 years old at the time. The boy had stayed with his grandmother after the accident, eventually leaving the area for school and later university. Rachel tracked him down through academic publications. Mateo Ruiz was now a biologist working for a conservation project focused on plant species native to southern Costa Rica. Rachel wrote him a letter careful and respectful. She explained her connection to Mark and included copies of the photographs. She asked if Mateo had ever heard stories from his father about guiding a young American photographer. 3 weeks later, a reply came. The envelope was thick and handwritten. Inside was a letter that began with an apology for the delay and a confession that Mateo had indeed heard stories about an American named Mark. His father had mentioned him once in a journal entry written 2 days before he died. The entry described taking a man deep into the jungle farther than usual and leaving him near a river fork where strange drumming had echoed through the canopy. Ernesto had written that he felt uneasy about the area. He had told the man to return before nightfall, but the man had insisted on staying longer. Mateo enclosed a copy of the journal entry. It ended with a line that chilled Rachel to her core. He followed the drums into the trees. I did not stop him. I should have. The entry confirmed that Mark had not been lost by accident. He had made a decision to explore something deeper, something that had likely seemed fascinating or urgent to a photographer seeking authenticity. The mention of drumming struck Rachel as significant. Not because it was eerie, but because it aligned with tribal behavior known to Mateo. He explained in his letter that certain indigenous communities had been known to use drumming as a signal not only for celebration but also for warnings. Most of these communities had since dispersed or integrated, but oral histories hinted at more reclusive groups that avoided all contact. Some of the symbols in the photographs Mateo believed might align with these oral records. But he emphasized that no academic study had ever confirmed their existence in the OSA Peninsula. They remained a myth. Rachel wrote back immediately. She asked if he would meet her in Costa Rica. She wanted to retrace her brother's steps. Mateo agreed. He was hesitant, aware of the risks, but he also understood what it meant to carry a question for decades without closure. In July 2002, they met for the first time at the airport in San Jose. Mateo was soft-spoken and serious with a journal always tucked under his arm. Rachel was prepared in her own way. She had studied maps for weeks. She had booked a guide, hired a translator, and packed for a journey that might end in nothing. But her instincts told her otherwise. There was still more buried out there. Mark had left clues behind, even if unintentionally. They traveled to La Palma and stayed at a local guest house. The town had changed little in 20 years. Dirt roads, tin-roofed shops, and the scent of plantains frying in open-air kitchens. Mateo led Rachel to the outskirts where his father's trail notes began. The old river path was no longer used. They had to hack through sections of overgrowth guided by sketches and Mateo's memory of his father's descriptions. They followed the stream for hours, listening for the sound of birds and distant howlers. Then they reached the fork. The trees grew tighter here. The air smelled different, richer, and older. Rachel pulled out the photo of the tree symbols and began scanning the trunks. It took time, but eventually she found one. A spiral. Faint, but still visible. She took a picture and marked the coordinates. They camped nearby, wary but focused. That night, as they sat by the fire, Rachel asked Mateo what he thought really happened. He hesitated before answering. He believed Mark had found something he was not meant to find. Whether it was a place, a group, or something else entirely, Mateo felt certain that his father had known more than he admitted. Perhaps guilt had followed him. Perhaps that was why he drove that night in the rain, distracted and lost in thought. Rachel nodded, understanding. Her brother had always been drawn to the unexplained. He had chased it willingly, but someone else had been with him at the end. The final photo proved it. What they did not yet know was whether that person had helped him or hurt him. Each step forward felt deliberate, as if they were entering a forgotten story still half-written. The trail was narrow and overgrown, forcing them to push through clusters of vines and twisted branches. Mateo led the way, machete in hand, clearing as they moved. Rachel followed closely, keeping her eyes open for anything that resembled the markings from Mark's photographs. The heat intensified quickly, and by mid-morning they were drenched in sweat, their clothes sticking to their backs. A sudden rise in elevation brought them to a ledge overlooking a clearing. It was there that they saw the stones. 5 large rocks stood in a semicircle formation, each one taller than a man. At the center lay what looked like a collapsed wooden structure now covered in moss and vegetation. Rachel raised her camera and took several shots. Mateo crouched to examine the ground, brushing aside leaves to reveal a pattern of flattened grass and broken branches. He looked up slowly, his expression tense. Someone had been there recently. The ground showed signs of disturbance, not by animals but by human boots. They entered the clearing carefully, their movements slow and deliberate. The wooden structure, though collapsed, had once been built with intention. Thick beams, hand-hewn and bound together with cord rather than nails. It was not a hut or a home. More likely, a shelter or observation post. Rachel knelt beside one of the beams and noticed deep notches carved along the side. They resembled tally marks, though uneven and sporadic. Some clusters appeared closer together, others spread apart. She counted silently, losing track after the 20th cluster. Mateo moved to one of the stone pillars. His fingers traced the surface, stopping at a faint indentation. It was the same spiral they had seen the day before. Only this time there was something more. Beneath the spiral was another symbol. A circle with a vertical line cut through it. Rachel photographed everything. She felt the weight of the moment settle into her chest like a stone. These were no longer hints. They were messages left intentionally. As they circled the clearing, Mateo suddenly froze. Rachel followed his gaze to the edge of the trees where a piece of fabric hung from a low branch. It was torn, sun-bleached, and frayed at the ends. Rachel reached for it, her hands trembling slightly. The pattern was faint but unmistakable, a faded, checkered stripe. She remembered it from an old photograph of Mark taken years before the trip. He had worn that shirt on the day he left Chicago. She pressed the fabric to her face, inhaling its scent. There was no blood, no indication of violence, but the fact that it remained intact after so many years suggested it had not been left by accident. Mateo checked the surrounding area, noting broken branches at shoulder height and fresh scrapes along a nearby trunk. Someone had passed through this clearing within the last year. They camped near the ridge that night, too tired to retrace their steps in the dark. The air grew colder with elevation, and Rachel wrapped herself in her jacket, watching the fire flicker as Mateo wrote in his journal. He spoke softly, recounting the years after his father's death. His grandmother had kept Ernesto's journals locked in a cabinet. As a child, Mateo had been forbidden to read them. It was only after her death that he discovered them again. The entries were brief but precise. Dates, locations, weather notes. But after 1987, the tone changed. The writing became more personal, almost fearful. Ernesto had described hearing voices in the trees and drums that seemed to come from nowhere. He had blamed it on exhaustion and heat, but the fear in his words had been clear. Mateo closed the journal and looked into the fire. He believed his father had seen something that haunted him, and he believed Mark had walked directly into it. The next morning, they descended back toward the river. The journey was quieter, the air heavier. Rachel felt a growing sense of disorientation. She checked the compass every hour. The readings shifted inexplicably. North seemed to drift, turning slowly with each checkpoint. Mateo offered no explanation, but his brow remained furrowed. When they reached the campsite, everything had been disturbed. Their tents were standing, but the contents had been emptied and scattered. Food wrappers lay torn open. Rachel's journal had been tossed into the dirt. Nothing of value was taken, but the intrusion was clear. Someone had been there and had made no effort to remain hidden. Mateo examined the ground again. No boot prints this time, just bare feet, small, narrow, and deep. Whoever had visited moved silently and deliberately. They were being watched. Rachel gathered her things quickly. The air around them felt different now. The jungle no longer hummed with its usual life. It felt too still. She decided they needed to return to town and regroup. They needed access to maps, to historical records, and perhaps more importantly, to stories. Mateo agreed. On their way back, they stopped by an old ranger station near the park's northern entrance. It had been closed for years, but a caretaker lived in the adjacent cabin. The man was old and nearly blind, but he remembered Ernesto. He also remembered a story from the year Mark disappeared. A search team had been mobilized, and for several days they combed the nearby trails. On the third night, one of the officers claimed to have seen someone watching them from the tree line, a man with long hair and no shoes standing still. The officer shouted, but the figure vanished. No one believed him. They chalked it up to nerves and fatigue. But the officer had written a report. It was filed and forgotten. Rachel and Mateo requested access to the local archives. The report was there buried among weather logs and expense receipts. It described the sighting in detail. A tall, white male roughly Mark's description, wearing a shirt that matched the checkered fabric Rachel had found. The officer had said the man looked confused but not afraid. He had stood for nearly a minute unmoving before turning and disappearing into the trees. The report ended with a note. The officer had resigned 2 months later, citing stress. Rachel sat in silence as she read the final paragraph. The story fit. Mark had been seen. He had survived long enough to be seen again. And yet no one followed. No one checked. Mateo placed his hand gently on her shoulder. They had reached something. A truth, maybe. But it still lay beneath layers of time buried under silence and doubt. The drive back to Puerto Jiménez was long and quiet. Rachel stared out the window of the Jeep as mud splashed against the side panels and tree branches brushed the glass. Mateo remained focused on the road, his hands tight on the wheel. Neither of them spoke for the first hour. The silence was not out of tension, but something heavier. The forest had shifted in their minds. It was no longer just landscape. It had become a character, a presence capable of concealing, watching, and perhaps even warning. Rachel replayed the story of the barefoot figure in her head. It was no longer a legend or the hallucination of a tired officer. It now had weight. Her brother had been there. Someone had seen him. He had been close enough to the edges of help, but it still remained just out of reach. That image haunted her more than any of the photos. To be seen and still left behind. That was the cruelty of it. They returned to the same guest house where they had stayed before the hike. The owner, a kind woman named Eliza, greeted them with soft concern. She had seen the exhaustion in travelers before, but something about Rachel's expression made her pause. Eliza offered them tea and a quiet place on the patio. As the sun dipped behind the jungle ridge, Rachel and Mateo spread out everything they had found. Photos, maps, copies of Ernesto's journals, the ranger's report. Mateo opened a notebook and began to sketch. He drew the rock formation, the spiral symbols, the collapsed shelter. Then he paused and circled something on the map. There was a bend in the Rio Sombra where the land dipped and a cluster of palm trees formed a natural boundary. Ernesto's journal had mentioned a second path leading west from that point. It was marked only once with the word compass. Mateo had always assumed it referred to a navigational landmark, but now he was not sure. Rachel leaned in, studying the line. If there was another structure or trail there, they needed to see it for themselves. They returned to the river the next morning, this time taking a narrower path that forked off after a mile. The terrain was different here. The ground was softer, the trees closer together. Birdsong returned briefly only to vanish again until they pushed deeper into the canopy. The air thickened, and Rachel felt her heart race from more than exertion. After 3 hours, they emerged into a clearing shaped like a shallow bowl. In the center stood a series of flat stones arranged in a circle around a smaller sunken stone platform. The outer stones were tall and flat, like slabs, their surfaces etched with the same spiral and line symbols. At the very center of the platform, half buried in vines, was an old metal object. Rachel rushed forward and brushed away the debris. It was a flask, dented and scratched but intact. On its side was a faint engraving. Her fingers traced the letters. M.E. Her breath caught. It was Mark's. Rachel opened the flask and found only damp air and rust, but wedged inside the hollow base was a folded scrap of paper. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear it. The ink was faded, but the writing was unmistakable. It was Mark's. The note was brief. They watch at night. Do not follow the music. The last sentence was smudged unreadable. Mateo leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowed. The message was not frantic, it was calm, deliberate. Mark had written it for someone. Maybe for himself, maybe for anyone who might find it. But it confirmed one thing beyond doubt. He had been alive long enough to process what was happening around him. He had understood that he was being watched, and he had chosen to leave a warning. They marked the coordinates and took photographs of everything. Mateo collected samples from the stone carvings, scraping off moss to reveal the full extent of the engravings. Rachel stood in silence, the flask in her hands, as memories of her brother filled her mind. He had always been methodical. He never wandered aimlessly. If he left this message here, it meant he had hoped it would be found. The placement was intentional. The location was remote, but reachable. That suggested he had tried to leave a trail, however faint. Rachel felt her grief shift again. It was no longer rooted in not knowing. It had become grief for the distance he had traveled, the isolation he had endured, and the fear he must have carried in his final days. They camped near the compass site that night. The moon was then barely more than a sliver behind the trees. Mateo built a small fire while Rachel kept the flask close. She could not sleep. Her mind ran through every clue, every phrase, every sighting. The compass, the flask, the warnings about music. She remembered the drumming Mateo's father had described in his journal. It had never been explained. Local authorities dismissed it as noise from distant festivities or perhaps echoing animal calls. But Rachel knew it was something else. The jungle had its own rhythm. What Mark had heard was not celebration. It was a signal, the kind that told you when to stop, when to listen, and when to run. In the early morning, just before dawn, Rachel rose and wandered to the edge of the clearing. The trees stood like silent sentinels, no wind, no sound. Then from far beyond the ridge she heard it, a soft pulsing beat, not loud, not rhythmic enough to be music, but deliberate, a pattern, one that did not belong to the birds or the wind. She turned to Mateo, who was now standing, his eyes wide. He had heard it too. Neither of them moved. They stood together, listening until it faded back into the trees. No one spoke for several minutes. When they finally packed their gear, they did so without discussion. They understood what it meant. The presence was still there. They returned to Puerto Jiménez in silence, carrying the flask and the message with them. Rachel sent the note to a handwriting expert who confirmed it matched other samples of Mark's writing from before his trip. The paper was dated based on the type of ink used, placing it within a reasonable time frame of his disappearance. The analysis gave the note a timestamp and anchor in the timeline of his final movements. She shared the findings with a local journalist who had covered missing person cases in the region. Within a week, the article was published quietly in a regional newsletter. No national coverage, no dramatic headlines. But the story began to circulate among those who remembered the case. A few former searchers reached out offering new recollections. One mentioned seeing similar stone patterns in another part of the park. Another recalled an area where radio signals always dropped without explanation. It took several days before Rachel could sleep through the night without waking in the middle of a dream filled with distant drumming and whispering leaves. The jungle had a way of lodging itself in the mind not just through memory but through sensation. The scent of decaying wood, the pressure of humid air, the way silence shifted when something unseen moved nearby. She and Matteo decided to review every piece of information again, this time with the intention of cross-referencing it against regional anthropological records. Rachel reached out to a retired professor who had once conducted a cultural survey in the southern rainforests of Costa Rica. She sent him photos of the symbols and described the compass site. A week later, he responded with a single observation. The symbols bore a resemblance to those used by a tribe that had once inhabited the region, but was believed to have vanished by the late 1980s. He included one word in his note that Rachel did not recognize. It was a name: Palaton. The professor had found it in a side note of a field journal from 1974. A remote village, supposedly deep within the rainforest near the upper fork of the Rio Sombra. The entry described unusual carvings, an avoidance of outsiders, and reports of total silence for miles around the site. No additional information existed. The village had never been mapped or studied officially. It was rumored to have been destroyed by landslides or forced relocation. Rachel showed the name to Matteo, who had never heard of it, but the location matched the direction they had not yet explored. He contacted a friend who worked with conservation teams and asked if there had been any deforestation or land surveys done in the region in the past 20 years. The friend replied with coordinates to a place where satellite images showed an irregular clearing, almost perfectly circular, with what appeared to be foundations covered by canopy growth. They packed and left the next morning. The trek took 2 days navigating old service roads and then hiking along narrow animal trails. The area was more remote than anything they had explored before. There were no signs of other travelers. No wrappers, no machete marks on trees. The jungle was denser and darker. Vines hung like ropes across the path. Matteo used a GPS device, but signal strength dropped steadily until they were forced to rely solely on compass bearings and topographical memory. They descended into a shallow basin and found what looked like the remnants of stone walls overgrown with vines and saplings. As they moved forward, the air grew still thick with the weight of something long buried. At the center of the clearing stood the remains of several circular huts reduced to outlines in the soil and scattered clay fragments. Rachel took photographs. Matteo knelt beside a cracked stone that bore a familiar spiral. They found more symbols along the path that ringed the village. They were not random. Each symbol was carved into the outer face of a standing stone, always facing outward, as if intended to mark territory. Inside the ruins, the earth had been disturbed at some point, though not recently. Rachel noticed faint impressions in the soil, the kind that heavy rain could not fully erase. She counted 3 separate clusters, each about the length of a human body. Matteo did not speak for a long time. Then he told her that these were likely graves. Not ancient ones, but shallow and recent enough to retain shape after years of storms. They stood in silence. Rachel's mind flooded with possibilities. Could one of them be Mark? They did not dig. It would have been wrong. They documented everything with care and left markers at the grave sites. Further in, near what appeared to be the largest former structure, Rachel noticed something odd. a rusted tin panel leaning against a tree. It did not belong there. She flipped it over, and beneath it lay a satchel. Inside was a faded map drawn on canvas brittle and stained with age. The markings were hand-drawn with charcoal. Some had been smudged beyond recognition, but others were clearly readable. One symbol near the center matched the compass site. Another, farther to the west, was circled in red. Next to it was a letter. Even Rachel traced it with her finger. They spent the night in the abandoned village, sleeping in shifts. Mateo kept the fire low. Rachel stared at the stars through the gap in the canopy and wondered how long her brother might have stayed here. The village had once been alive. Someone had lived here, and someone had hidden that satchel. Perhaps it had been Mark. Perhaps it had been someone else, someone who watched the forest the way Rachel now felt watched herself. In the morning, they explored the perimeter again. Behind one of the collapsed huts buried beneath layers of leaves, Mateo found a length of wire. It was too straight to be natural. He followed it with careful hands and uncovered the remains of a shortwave radio antenna. The base had been scorched, likely by lightning or fire. Rachel stood over the ruined metal and thought of the message someone had once received in 1989. A weak signal. A voice asking for help. Signed, Me. The presence of a radio confirmed that someone had tried to reach out. The satchel, the graves, the symbols all pointed to a single conclusion. Mark had made it this far. Whether he had arrived alone or had been taken there, he had stayed. He had mapped the region, marked the stones, perhaps even tried to communicate. But he had not escaped. The reasons for that were still unclear. Had he been trapped, injured? Was he hiding from something? Rachel sat on the edge of a broken stone and stared at the overgrowth around her. She imagined him sitting in the same place years earlier, drawing symbols on cloth rationing supplies, waiting for a signal to break through. They left the village with photographs, the satchel, and a GPS marker. Rachel was quiet during the hike back. The weight of proximity was heavier than the weight of mystery. She had touched places he had touched. She had stood where he had once stood. And yet, he was still missing. But now, the story had shape. The abandoned village, once known as Palaton, was real. The signs, the graves, the antenna all pointed to an attempt at survival, an attempt at communication, and perhaps a decision to remain hidden or a failure to escape. This part of the journey did not offer answers. It offered presence, and presence was its own form of truth. Rachel returned to Chitigo with the satchel tucked carefully inside her carry-on. It rested beside her like a fragile artifact, its weight disproportionate to its size. She handed it to a forensic archivist at a private university who specialized in preserving materials recovered from extreme environments. The satchel was examined for fingerprints, DNA, and trace elements. The results took over a month. When they arrived, the answers were partial yet startling. Faint traces of skin cells were found on the interior fabric. The DNA, when cross-referenced with a sample Rachel had submitted years ago, indicated a familial match. It confirmed what she had suspected. The satchel had belonged to her brother. She held the results in her hands and felt the numbness return. Proof brought a strange kind of grief. It did not soothe or resolve. It sharpened. Mark had touched that canvas, zipped it shut, and hidden it with the intent that someone might one day find it. Rachel had done just that, but she had not found him. The satchel's contents included the map, a rusted compass, and a folded scrap of cloth that appeared to be part of a shirt. The cloth was sent for testing. Embedded within the weave were faint particles of blood, too small to see, but enough for typing. The results showed that the blood was human and belonged to someone with O-negative blood type, the same as Mark. The cloth also had signs of plant resin and mold native to the OSA Peninsula, indicating it had remained in the jungle environment for an extended period. Rachel sent the results to Mateo, who began cross-referencing the plant resin with those found near Palaton. One match stood out. It was a tree known to produce a mild anesthetic sap. Locals once used it in traditional medicine to treat wounds and induce sleep. Rachel wondered whether Mark had used it for pain relief or if someone had used it on him. The forensic team also analyzed the soil samples collected from the graves near the abandoned village. Though the team did not exhume the bodies, surface-level testing provided valuable information. The bones were relatively recent, no older than 25 years. 3 sets of remains were confirmed. All were adult males. None showed signs of ceremonial burial. The shallow nature of the graves, their irregular spacing, and the absence of personal belongings suggested either a hurried burial or abandonment. Rachel requested permission to conduct further forensic analysis on the skeletal remains. With the help of a Costa Rican cultural liaison and a local anthropologist, an exhumation was approved under academic supervision. The bones were transported to a lab in San Jose. There, forensic specialists cleaned, cataloged, and examined them for trauma, age, and identity markers. One of the skulls showed signs of blunt force trauma to the left temple. The fractures were consistent with repeated strikes likely inflicted with a tool or weapon. Another skull bore signs of a healed fracture on the forearm, suggesting the individual had survived a prior injury. When dental records were requested, Rachel submitted Mark's last known dental chart. After a 2-week review, the lab confirmed a match. The skull with the healed fracture belonged to Mark Ellison. Rachel received the call while sitting in her kitchen. The voice on the other end was steady and careful. The words came one by one, each landing like a stone. Her brother had been found. After 18 years, the mystery had reached its most painful truth. She hung up and sat still for a long time. The house felt quieter than usual. Outside, the city moved on unaware that a decades-old absence had just been resolved. She called Mateo and shared the news. He did not speak for a while, only exhaled slowly. Together, they had found him. Not alive, not whole, but found. And that mattered more than anything else now. Rachel flew back to Costa Rica for the remains. She met the forensic team in a small municipal building where the bones had been prepared for repatriation. The team showed her the full report. Mark's injuries indicated he had likely lived for several weeks after his initial disappearance. The healing on his arm suggested he had received care, or at least survived long enough to begin recovery. The blunt force trauma to his skull had been fatal. The angle and depth of the fractures indicated that he had not fallen. He had been struck likely multiple times. No murder weapon was recovered, no suspects, no forensic trace of a third party, but the cause of death was clear. Rachel signed the release documents and arranged for the remains to be flown home. The funeral was small. Family, a few friends, and several people who had followed the story through quiet channels. She placed the satchel beside the urn. The photographs lined a nearby table. The image of Mark by the campfire, the map, the spiral carvings. They had all told the story before the forensics had confirmed it. Her brother had disappeared, yes, but he had not been lost. He had been found in pieces across time through persistence. Mateo flew in for the service. He stood beside Rachel and said nothing, his presence enough. They had followed the clues together. They had given Mark a voice again. In the days that followed, Rachel reviewed the final documents. The forensic report included a chart of injuries, a timeline of decomposition, and a list of artifacts. One detail stood out. The healed fracture on Mark's arm had left a groove that showed signs of splinting. This meant someone had cared for him. Someone had helped him heal. Whether it was a member of the Palatine village, another traveler, or someone entirely unknown, the implication was undeniable. Mark had not died immediately. He had been alive long enough to be treated to regain strength and to try again. This fact changed the shape of the narrative in Rachel's mind. Her brother had not simply wandered into danger. He had survived danger, faced it, and continued moving. 2 months after the funeral, Rachel sat alone in the same home office where her journey had begun. The walls still bore the photos of the jungle, the compass stones, and the carved spirals. The space felt quieter now, but not in the way silence usually brought peace. It was a quieter kind of urgency, one that carried the residue of answers and the echo of new questions. Her brother's remains had been laid to rest, yet her thoughts kept returning to the evidence of his last days. The fracture that had healed. The satchel hidden carefully. The message that someone had helped him. She felt an obligation to know who. There was a final thread she needed to follow, one she had nearly forgotten until she reviewed a note from the forensic report that mentioned radio components. She remembered the story about the ham operator in Costa Rica who claimed to have received a signal signed with her brother's initials. At the time, it had seemed like a strange anecdote. Now, it felt like a critical piece. Rachel contacted the U.S. consulate in San Jose and requested assistance in locating the operator. She was referred to an archive of licensed radio users from the 1980s and found 3 active names in the region. After several phone calls and more dead ends, she reached a man named Thomas Medrano, who lived in a coastal town near Quepos. He was in his 70s, now retired, and still operated his ham radio from a modest bungalow surrounded by plantains and banana trees. When she asked about the broadcast, he paused for a long time before responding. He remembered it clearly. It had been a quiet night in July of 1989 when he picked up a faint signal that repeated the same phrase in English every 30 seconds. "This is Mark Ellison, requesting help, coordinates unknown, please respond." He wrote it down, kept the record, and even noted the signal strength. It had lasted for about 3 minutes before fading out. Rachel flew down the following week and visited him in person. Thomas welcomed her with a worn kindness, as if he had been waiting for her to arrive all along. He led her to the back room, where his radio equipment sat on an old wooden table. He pulled out a faded notebook and showed her the page from 1989. The signal time was written in red ink, and beneath it were 3 short lines of transcription. "This is Mark Ellison, requesting help, coordinates unknown." Thomas had tried to respond, but the voice never came back. Rachel stared at the page, imagining her brother hunched over a makeshift transmitter trying to break through miles of interference and isolation. The distance between the voice and the help he needed had been too wide. Yet even in that gap, he had reached someone. Thomas explained that he had reported the transmission at the time to local authorities, but no formal action was taken. He was just a private operator. No one had followed up. It was not until years later, when he read about Mark's disappearance, that he realized the name matched the voice he had heard. He had considered writing to the family, but did not know how to contact them. He apologized for the delay. Rachel did not blame him. She thanked him and asked if he still had the equipment. He did. It was not the same model, but he had kept the antenna and parts of the original setup. Rachel asked if it was possible to track the origin of the signal. Thomas admitted it would be difficult now. The transmission had not been triangulated and no exact coordinates were ever identified. But based on the frequency and strength, he estimated that it had come from somewhere within the OSA Peninsula, most likely near the upper stretch of the Rio Sombra. Rachel shared the information with Mateo, who immediately recognized the connection. The river's upper stretch ran past the abandoned village and continued into the deeper forest, where few ever ventured. Mateo remembered a cave system marked on an old geological survey he had once studied. The entrance had been sealed off after a series of rockfalls in the late 1980s. Few had ever explored it fully. If Mark had been hiding healing or trying to broadcast from somewhere, a cave would have offered shelter and concealment. They decided to return one last time. Mateo arranged for permits through his conservation contacts. Rachel flew back to Costa Rica with a field team and a geologist. Together, they hiked beyond the known trails, following the curve of the river to the place where the cave entrance had once been reported. The area was overgrown and unmarked. It took hours of cutting through vines and underbrush before they located a collapsed section of rock partially covering a narrow opening. The air from the hole was stale but breathable. They set up lights and crawled inside. The interior widened quickly, revealing a dome-like chamber with soot marks along the walls and remnants of burned wood. It had been used as shelter. They found rusted cans, pieces of cloth, and fragments of wire. In one corner, buried beneath loose gravel, was a corroded metal box. Inside was a shortwave radio transmitter, damaged but still recognizable. The dials were set to the frequency Thomas had recorded. Rachel held the box in her hands and closed her eyes. She could see it now. Mark, sitting here injured alone, repeating his name into the void, not knowing if anyone would hear. There was one more discovery. Tucked inside a narrow crevice near the chamber's edge was a piece of cloth with handwriting. It was nearly illegible, but one line stood out. Still here, waiting, not safe. Rachel folded the cloth and kept it close. They documented everything. The cave, the fire marks, the radio. The evidence painted a picture of survival and desperation. Mark had made it that far. He had found refuge, sent a signal, and left behind a final message. What had happened after remained a question, but the clues were no longer scattered. They had formed a path. One that began with a photo and ended in a cave where a man had once called for help and hoped for a reply. The cave discovery brought renewed interest to Mark's case from a surprising source. A retired Costa Rican official named Hernan Calderon contacted Rachel through Mateo. He had once overseen environmental development permits in the OSA Peninsula during the 1980s. Hernan had read about the cave findings in a regional scientific bulletin. He requested a private meeting with Rachel and Mateo in San Jose. When they met him at a quiet cafe tucked between bookstores and flower stalls, he brought with him a weathered brown folder tied with string. He set it gently on the table and explained that what he was about to share had never made it into public record. During his tenure, he had been instructed to approve an unusual biological study under the guise of forestry management. The site in question had been near the upper Rio Sombra. The research was not well documented, but it involved studying a rare tree fungus found only in that region. The scientists were not local. They were foreign contractors working with private funding. He remembered one thing clearly. The team left after only 4 months abruptly and without notice. Rachel leaned forward, trying to control the growing pressure in her chest. Hernan slid the folder across the table. Inside were copies of permits, field reports, and notes scribbled in the margins of an official journal. One entry stood out. It mentioned a mild neurotoxin secreted by the fungus capable of altering perception and inducing long-term disorientation. The note had been circled and underlined. Rachel asked whether any of this had been linked to missing persons. Hernan nodded, then hesitated. In 1987, a local park ranger had disappeared within days of visiting the fungal study zone. His body was never recovered. The case was never officially connected to the research, but internally, the event caused panic among the contractors. Within a week, the team dismantled their base and left the country. The journal notes suggested that some suspected exposure through airborne spores could have occurred. There was no medical follow-up. The study ended without conclusion. Rachel felt her breath grow shallow. If Mark had stumbled into that area during his trek, he could have been exposed. It would explain his erratic behavior, his injuries, his confused movements recorded in the notes. The drumming he described, the carvings. Perhaps they were symptoms, or perhaps they were real and exacerbated by the exposure. Mateo asked whether any physical remnants of the study remained. Hernan said he did not know. He had signed off on the decommissioning, but no one had followed up. The site was inaccessible during the rainy season and no further studies had been approved. He believed the base had been constructed near a flat ridge above the river bend. That ridge was less than a mile from the cave where Mark's radio had been found. Rachel and Mateo returned to the jungle with a narrowed search grid. They brought a small team, including a botanist and a geologist. The group moved slowly, documenting flora as they advanced. Within 2 days, they found remnants of concrete platforms and metal brackets buried beneath moss and fallen branches. The shape of the ground suggested a former outpost. Nearby glass vials and fragments of lab equipment littered the area, now stained and cracked by decades of rain and decay. The botanist identified several fungal growths along a nearby tree base, including one species that matched the old notes. It excreted a sticky amber-colored resin. The substance tested positive for neuroactive compounds. Prolonged exposure could cause hallucinations, memory loss, and paranoia. Rachel walked to the perimeter of the former base and tried to visualize Mark approaching it from the jungle. If he had been injured or already disoriented, the effects of the fungus would have compounded his condition. He might have seen figures where there were none. He might have carved symbols in an attempt to make sense of things. Or worse, he might have encountered others who had already succumbed to the exposure. The village, the drums, the silent observers. Could they have been people affected by the same substance caught in their own distortions of reality? The theory was grim, but it explained much. Mark had not simply gotten lost. He had entered a zone abandoned for its danger, forgotten by those who had built it, and remembered only by the forest itself. Later that evening, the team analyzed one of the recovered lab notebooks left behind in a rusted filing cabinet. The entries were sparse but direct. On day 45, a note read, "Subject exhibited confusion. Auditory hallucinations failed to respond to simple commands. No fever. Reflexes intact." On day 61, another note said abandoning study. Risk outweighs gain. No viable treatment documented. Rachel read each page slowly. Her brother may have been one of those subjects, or he may have arrived after the project had ended. Either way, the environment had been toxic. Not from hostility, but from indifference and secrecy. Mateo compiled a report and submitted it to local authorities and academic journals. The site was flagged for hazardous environmental conditions. A new sign was placed at the river junction warning hikers to avoid the upper ridge due to unstable terrain and biological risks. Rachel stood beside the post as it was installed. She stared into the forest the same direction her brother had once walked. The truth was not a single moment, but a series of cascading failures. A forgotten study. A brother who ventured too far. A sister who never stopped looking. And a jungle that never gave up its secrets easily. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the branches as Rachel walked the narrow trail alone. The final stretch of the jungle path curved gently downward toward the very ridge where the old base had once stood. Much of the debris had been cleared by the cleanup crew, though traces remained. Bent metal rods stuck out of the earth like fractured bones. The forest had begun to reclaim the space vines crawling over exposed concrete leaves covering footprints from the previous team. Rachel paused near the edge where the river below shimmered in the broken light. She sat down on a large stone, the same one where she had first seen the outline of the rusted platform, and pulled out her notebook. The pages were filled now. She had documented everything. The photographs, the cave, the carvings, the radio, the old reports, and the final truth of what had happened to her brother. Yet the weight of the story had not lessened. It had merely shifted. She no longer carried it as a question, but as a memory. Mateo arrived moments later. He did not speak at first. He simply sat beside her, letting the silence fill the space between them. He had changed over the months. His beard had grown thicker. His eyes carried less urgency but more reflection. They had been through something that few would ever understand. They had traced a man's final steps not through violence or conspiracy, but through the stubborn will to survive and the quiet marks he left behind. Mateo handed her a small wooden box. It was carved with spiral symbols and lined with soft cloth. Inside lay Mark's compass. They had recovered it near the base, half buried beneath decaying leaves. It had survived better than most of his belongings. Rachel held it in her palm and watched the needle settle. It pointed north, steady and reliable, as if waiting for someone to follow it again. Back in Chicago, Rachel returned to her family home for the first time in years. Her mother's belongings had been packed away after her passing, but the study remained as it had been. Books lined the shelves. Mark's photographs still hung above the desk. Rachel stood before one that had always haunted her. It showed a waterfall somewhere in Costa Rica, the water blurred from motion, and a faint figure in the distance near the edge. She had once hoped it might have been him. Now she knew it could not have been, but the idea had kept her searching. She placed the compass beside the photo and sat down to write. She had been asked to contribute to an article about recovery and resilience, but her words came from somewhere deeper. She wrote not about the mystery or the investigation, but about endurance, about how some people disappear without fading, about how stories can hold people in place when time tries to erase them. She visited the university archives to donate Mark's journal, the satchel, and the field maps. The curator promised to preserve them and include them in a case study about unsolved disappearances with eventual resolution. Rachel requested a small plaque with her brother's name and the dates of his life. She wanted him remembered not for the gap between those years, but for what he had endured. Not every story had villains. Some stories were simply filled with silence and shadows, and the struggle to move forward. As she left the building, she noticed a student reading from the display. He looked up and nodded to her, unaware of who she was, but still connected somehow by the narrative now placed in front of him. That was enough. Mateo returned to his fieldwork. He kept a section of the trail closed and advocated for new regulations around previously disturbed regions. He carried a copy of the fungal research study with him and used it to lobby for better environmental accountability. One afternoon, he sent Rachel a photo of a new sign posted along the ridge. It read Restricted Zone and listed biological risk as the reason. No mention of Mark, no mention of the study, but the truth was they're embedded in the soil and the silence. Rachel printed the photo and pinned it next to her desk. It was a small victory, but it mattered. Rachel began to receive letters. Some came from families with missing loved ones. Others came from readers who had followed her story in the journal. They asked about the search, about what it felt like to find someone after so long. She answered each letter with honesty. She did not provide comfort, she provided truth. That closure was not a door closing, it was a window opening. Sometimes what came through was sunlight. Sometimes it was just wind, but it was always movement, always something that allowed the heart to shift slightly toward peace. A year after the discovery, she returned one last time to the jungle. She brought only a backpack, a notebook, and the compass. Mateo met her at the ranger station. They walked together through familiar paths past trees they had once marked over bridges they had crossed during rains. The jungle had grown slightly. The paths were tighter. Vines had returned. But the compass still pointed the same way. They reached the clearing where the compass stone stood. She placed a small marker there, a smooth river stone painted with Mark's initials. No ceremony, no speech, just presence. On the way back, they stopped near the river where the sound of water drowned the noise of insects. Rachel sat and let the current speak for a while. She pulled out her notebook and wrote her final entry. She described the weight of silence, the way it could wrap around a person until they disappeared from more than just maps. How voices needed paths to travel, and sometimes those paths were blocked by fear or failure or the deep distance of jungle. But she also wrote about the strength it took to leave a mark, to carve a symbol, to hide a satchel, to repeat your name into the radio and believe that someone might hear. She closed the notebook and handed it to Mateo. He promised to archive it, to keep it safe, not as an artifact but as a reminder. They walked the last mile in silence. The jungle seemed softer now. Not welcoming, not kind, but honest. Rachel stepped into the clearing one last time and looked back. There was no monument, no cross, no flag. Just the forest and the sound of leaves brushing against each other like old stories being told again. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more gripping mysteries just like this one. Let us know in the comments what you think really happened to Mark and where in the world you're watching from. We read every comment, and your thoughts help shape future stories.